Hi. My name is Thibault Porssut. I will present today our paper called Reconciling Being Control versus Being Help for the Execution of a Complex Movement in Virtual Reality. But first, let me introduce our motivation. We want to use full body motion capture and VR headset to let the user to have this sense of owning, controlling a virtual body, an avatar, in virtual reality. This is being in control. And we also want to help the user to execute a complex movement in VR. This is being helped. And we want to do the both in the same times. It's reconciling. In one sentence, what we want to do is to help the user to execute a complex movement while maintaining a good embodiment in virtual reality. But what is embodiment? First, let me introduce some definitions. When I was talking about this feeling of controlling a virtual body, in fact, it's what we call the sense of agency. When I was talking this feeling to owning a virtual body, in fact, it's what we call the body ownership. We have also a third definition, which is the safe locations. This is the feeling to be located within one's body. You need at least one of these components to ensure what we call the sense of embodiment. If you disrupt one of these components, you will have what we call a break in embodiment. But how can we help the user? We can help the user thanks to movement distortion. One of the first to use movement distortion was Burns. He was using movement distortion to prevent any visual interpenetration. Here in this experiment, the user was controlling a virtual hand, and the user has to go through the virtual table. There is no real table, and in doing so, in fact, the virtual table will be stopped above the virtual table, and you will have a distortion between the real hand and the virtual hand. You will have a distortion. But Burns has shown it's better to have a distortion compared to have a visual interpenetration. However, in our case, we are not interested to prevent visual interpenetration. What we want to do is to help the user to execute a complex movement while maintaining a good embodiment. Our first hypothesis is, if we help too much the user, so if the distortion is too high, you will break the embodiment. The user will reject this distortion. However, the user, even if he detects this distortion, at a certain point, he will tolerate this distortion. We'll manage to maintain a good embodiment. The last one is, if you introduce this distortion progressively, we can increase what we call the self-attribution threshold. It's when the user detects more than 50% of the time the distortion and affect less the embodiment. This is our three hypotheses. Now, we need a distortion. This distortion is what we call the attraction well. In this case, you can see here in red the real user posture, in gray the virtual posture of the avatar, and in green the target. We apply a field, this is our distortion, which attracts the virtual harm to the target to help the user. On the right, on the graphic, here you are out of the field, and the both are collocated. More you are pushed to the target, more you will be helped by the distortion, and more distortion you will have. You will reach a maximum here, J. And in fact, here this distance is the radius of the target. When you enter in the target, the distortion begins to decrease. Here, at the end, when you reach the center of the target, you have no more distortion. The both are collocated again. But now, how can we evaluate this distortion? We have this protocol, a first calibration for the full motion capture system, a training, and two blocks. The first block is what we call the full distortion, because, in fact, the J value, the maximum distortion, is constant during the trials, contrary to the block 2, progressive introduction, where this J value will increase progressively from 0 until the maximum value during the trial. In the block 1, we have several distortion values comprised in a range of 0 and 2, with a step of 0.25. And in block 2, we test only 3 values, 0, 2, and 100. Now, how can we evaluate this distortion and the embodiment? We ask 4 yes-no questions at the end of each trial. So the first is about the sense of body ownership, the second about the agency. The fourth is the self-attribution, so we just ask the subject when he detects this distortion, and a control, just to ensure the subject read the question and understand the question. We didn't ask any question about the self-location because we never change the position of the user. The user is always collocated with a virtual body. So now let me introduce the task. So here in gray is the avatar, in red is the real user poster. So the user is holding a tennis ball, and in order to start the trial, he has to put this tennis ball in a green target. The green target will begin to move following an elliptical trajectory, a non-biological movement. I can explain it later if you're interested. And it will perform 3 rounds. And if you are in the case of progressive introduction, in fact, the distortion will be full at the end of the second round. Now let me introduce the result. So first, we calculate the self-attribution threshold. So here, we measure the detection rate, which is the number of yes of the self-attribution question divided by all the answer. So we do that for each subject and each distortion value in the block 1 only, because it's only in this one we have enough distortion value. Then we try to fit a sigmoid function in order to get a psychometric function. And we can get the self-attribution threshold for one subject. Here it's 0.8, it's an example. We have to do that for each subject in order to get the self-attribution threshold mean, 1.33. But as you can see, we have a pretty important standard deviation, 0.31. It means we have a huge intervariability between subjects. Now, we want to see if this progressive distortion has an impact on the self-attribution threshold. So here we compute the self-attribution score, which is the same, but for all the subjects. So as you can see, we have a significant difference. When we introduce this distortion progressively, the score is higher. In fact, it means for the subject, it's harder for them to detect the distortion when we introduce this one progressively. Now, we want to see the impact of this distortion on the score, of the body ownership score and agency score. As you can see, there is a decrease in the both block when you increase the distortion. However, in the block 1, this decrease is not significant. It means, in fact, the subject will detect the distortion, but will still tolerate this distortion. So we will manage to maintain a good embodiment. However, in the second block, when this value is too high, at 100, the user rejects this distortion. So we have a break in embodiment. So now I would like to introduce the limitation. So the limitations are, if you really want to ensure the user is not able to detect your distortion, you will have to calibrate your distortion for each user, because you have this huge intervariability between subjects. We have evaluated this distortion for only one predefined movement, elliptical movement, non-biological. It would be interesting to do it for several types of predefined movement. Also, we fail to show that the progressive distortion affects less the embodiment. For future application, we think this one can be useful for video games, in the one where if you don't have any haptic feedback, it will be hard to execute the interaction. For example, a boat simulation if you have a winch, or a drive simulation. It can also be useful for motor rehabilitation. Indeed, it has been shown that subjects which had a stroke, when we ask them to execute a movement, we can show them a good performance and it can accelerate the rehabilitation. So now, let's imagine, he looked to the performance and he believes it's its own movement. We think if you add this embodiment component, you will accelerate even more the rehabilitation. My take-home message. So, our attraction well distortion managed to maintain a good embodiment if you stay under 2. The user easily accepts help to achieve a complex movement in this case. However, if your distortion is too high, the subject will definitely reject your distortion. So you have to pay attention. And finally, if you introduce progressively this distortion, you can increase the self-attribution threshold. I would like to thank the Swiss National Fund and Francesca Guillouge for its huge help. Thank you for your attention, and we'll be pleased to answer your question.
So we have time for a few questions. Okay, I'll ask one to break the ice. So when you found your result about the distortion, do you think, how would you think that your results might tie into body ownership and in relation to latency or perceived latency? Do you think there are some similar results there, or?
Okay, thank you for the question. So it's very interesting. In fact, yes. For example, the thing is, a subject is not able to really perceive its exact position for so the proprioception is pretty bad as this. So if you have, for example, some latency, if its latency is not too huge, this one can show that, in fact, the user can still embody the virtual body. If it's your question.
Any other questions? Okay, let's thank our speaker again.